Hi, welcome back to the Eat Well, Think Well, Live Well podcast. I'm Lisa Salisbury, and my mission is to help women stop obsessing about everything they eat and feel confident about their ability to lose weight without a diet app. This week, we're going to be talking about hunger hormones and snacking. Do you find yourself snacking throughout the day, just constantly grabbing food in between meals or every time you pass through the kitchen? I used to think that eating 6 times a day or even more was actually the healthy thing to do, and that I was keeping my, quote, metabolism going. But the truth is, there are many, many reasons to avoid snacking or eating between full meals. My guest today is Dr. Chelsea Azarcon, who is a naturopathic doctor in Northern California. We talk about her journey to health and healing herself along the way with treating her patients, and then we get into the meat of this episode with learning about hunger hormones, insulin resistance and insensitivity, and snacking. You'll learn about the many benefits to avoiding snacking and what to do instead. Welcome to Eat Well, Think Well, Live Well, the podcast for women who want to lose weight but are tired of counting and calculating all the food. I'm your host, Lisa Salisbury. I'm a certified health and weight loss coach and life coach, and most importantly, a recovered chronic dieter. I'll teach you to figure out why you are eating when you aren't hungry instead of worrying so much about what you are eating. Welcome, everybody, back to the Eat Well, Think Well, Live Well podcast. I have Dr. Chelsea, forgot to ask how you say your last name, Azarcon. Is that right?
Azarcon, yeah.
Okay, great. She's a naturopath here in my area. Actually, we connected on Instagram and I instantly was like, I love everything she's talking about. I'll let her introduce herself and then we'll go from there.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to chat today. So as you mentioned, I am a naturopathic doctor here in the Northern California area. And I got interested in naturopathic medicine through my own journey with lifelong health issues. I'd been all over to the Mayo Clinic and UCLA Hospital and all kinds of naturopathic doctors, and nobody quite knew what was wrong. So I really got interested in integrated medicine through that. So I think one unique thing is that I am healing while I'm helping people heal. Back when I was looking for answers, there wasn't this explosion of functional medicine like there is now. So testing that everybody knows about now took me years and years to find. And so as a consequence of that, I'm healing. But it's really fun because it gives me just this focus and this drive to always be learning something new for myself and because I know what my patients are going through. So integrated medicine with a personal twist.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So tell us what's going on with your health. Is it something other people struggle with that they might get some benefit from learning about what you have going on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of been a long journey of mystery illnesses. I was a very colicky baby, and that kind of turned into lactose intolerance. And I actually went to an iridologist, which is this kind of woo-woo type of alternative practitioner that diagnoses by looking in your eyes. And she put me on a grain-free, sugar-free, dairy-free diet, like back in the 90s when nobody was doing that.
Oh, wow, that is early.
Yeah, there was nothing like that out there. I was one of the only people doing it. And so I got a lot better after that. And then I ended up having, when I was a kid, a bacterial infection in my lymph nodes. And we still don't really know what caused it. I got a big dose of antibiotics for that. And that kind of turned into a lot of GI issues, a lot of autoimmune type conditions that they know are caused by autoimmune illness, but they couldn't find an autoimmune illness. But I was diagnosed a few years ago with Lyme disease, which you think with all the mystery illness someone would have found before a few years ago. I
Yeah.
actually ended up treating that myself with the mRNA therapy, and I've been doing really well as far as the Lyme stuff goes since then. But I've also been working on toxins for about the past 6 years, and recently mold and chronic inflammatory response issues. But I think, as a lot of people in the functional medicine community know, those things affect a lot of other systems. They affect your metabolism, which I know we've connected about. They affect your hormones. So there's a lot of pieces that I'm working on with the toxicity issue. And then there's post mold and there's post Lyme, and I'm healing from both.
Okay, it's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah,
And just for those listening that might have some mystery illness, by the way, sorry, my dog is barking.
no
It's
worries.
like
It happens
all the
to me
time.
a lot.
It's like so many packages being delivered. We're
Yeah,
recording right before Christmas. And so she's like,
uh-huh.
has to tell me every time someone comes to the door.
No worries.
It's helpful for people to hear to like keep looking and if you know your body best, if you know something's going on, like don't take there's nothing wrong with you as the first answer and just, keep going. So, I think that's really important for
Yeah, I
people to
agree.
understand.
I had put this
Yeah.
cool question on my Instagram the other day, like, what are your obstacles to working with a functional doctor? Because, I had this decades long history of trying to find answers, but I can give a patient in a single visit all those labs that took me years and years and years to find. And so I think there's lots of good functional practitioners and coaches that people can work with now. And I asked, what's your obstacle? And somebody answered, finding somebody that I trust. And I think that's so
Mm,
important. If you feel like there's something wrong with your body and your doctor's not agreeing, invest in yourself and go find somebody who will help you explore what you're intuitively feeling.
yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, today we're actually not going to be talking about autoimmune and those other kinds of things. Dr. Chelsea is going to teach us a little bit about our hunger hormones, how they play a role in our body. This is something I go over with my clients as well, but I am so excited to have more of a authority on this than me to really go through this because as you'll hear, insulin resistance is one of the biggest obstacles with weight loss.
Mhm.
And so knowing what's going on with our hunger hormones in the body is actually so important. So tell us what those are and what they do.
So there's three main players when it comes to hunger hormone. The first is leptin, and leptin is our satiety hormone. So it signals to our brain that we're full. And what it basically does is it shuts down the feeding processes in the brain. And leptin is actually secreted by our fat cells in proportion to the amount of fat that we have. So when we have more fat, we're secreting more leptin to tell our brain, hey, we don't need to be upregulating feeding processes right now. The complement to leptin is ghrelin, and ghrelin is our hunger hormone. And ghrelin is secreted by the same cells in your stomach that secrete hydrochloric acid. And so when our stomachs get empty, when we're hungry, when we have stimulation of digestive processes, ghrelin is released and it tends to peak before a meal to tell our bodies to eat. And then insulin is kind of the coordinator of.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. Let me ask you a question about ghrelin. I have learned that it can also kind of turn on by the clock, which is why like I'll have clients, especially that are teachers that have lunch break from 12:14 to
Mhm,
12:34, whatever it is. And so
mhm.
their ghrelin gets activated right before that. And so they feel hungry, even if maybe they've had a snack earlier or they, had a big breakfast. So they may not actually need food, but they get this hunger signal, which is kind of a false hunger signal from that ghrelin coming by the clock. Do you find that to be accurate?
I've not seen the research on that, but most of the hunger
Mm.
hormones do have a time related pattern. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that's true. And it makes sense if you think about like a lot of times when people are practicing fasting, they'll get hungry in the mornings. But sugars will be fine. And if you kind of push through that hunger in the morning, your body will kind of stabilize and you won't feel hungry or depleted all day, but it's just that clock your body gets used to eating at certain times.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So then insulin was the next one you were going to talk about.
Yeah, so insulin is secreted after we eat, and insulin, I like to describe it as a doorbell. So it basically lets our cells know that sugar is here and it's ready to be taken up into the cells and to be used for fuel. So it gets our sugar out of the blood and it gets our sugar put to good use.
Okay. And what happens then to that sugar? What cells does it go to? What if there's too much sugar? What does the insulin do then?
Yeah, good question. So usually we want our sugar to go to skeletal muscle tissue. We want it to go to our brain tissue. So tissues that's actually going to use that glucose, and then it's put through a series of chemical reactions for your body, for your intracellular compartments to make energy. So if there's too much sugar in the blood, your body wants to get glucose out of the blood because glucose is a pretty abrasive or damaging molecule in the blood. It can damage neurons, damage blood vessels, and so it will actually go and shunt and store glucose in fat. And I think there's two consequences to think about there. I think for a long time, people focused on, well, glucose is going to fat, it's causing weight gain, which is totally true. But then what happens if your glucose isn't getting into the cells? It's not being used to make energy. So your cells are starved. You feel like you haven't gotten enough nutrition. But the problem is actually that you're not using your fuel to make energy.
Okay. So, what happens then with insulin resistance? Because this is, I think most people know, this is kind of the precursor to getting into prediabetes, diabetes. If you're insulin resistant, then it's confusing because it's like you have all this insulin, but it's not working properly. How can we understand that for how can we dumb it down for the rest of us?
Yeah, good question. So there's a couple things that can go wrong with insulin. It would be when you're secreting too much of it. And from too much, I mean a functional perspective. So if you have insulin that's out of range on a lab value, that usually is caused by like an insulin secreting tumor. So I'm not talking about a pathological amount of insulin. I'm talking about
Mhm.
when you're creating too much insulin, and I'll explain why in a minute, or when you have insulin being secreted too frequently. So it's around all the time. What happens in both of those scenarios is that the receptors stop becoming responsive to insulin, or they stop listening to insulin. They kind of tune it out. And then
Mhm.
you,
So it's like teenagers when they're
yeah,
like,
exactly.
how
Well,
we can think of it when your
sometimes,
parents are like,
sometimes I'll say, because I describe insulin as the doorbell, someone just taped the doorbell down, or you got like that annoying kid at the door that's pressing it over and over. You just kind of tune it out. That's what happens.
Mhm.
That's what's happening with your cells in response to insulin. And then that leads to you have, in many cases, more than enough insulin, because then your body starts making more insulin to try and overcome this lack of responsiveness. So in many cases, you have more than enough insulin. That's not the problem. It's that the machinery, the communication pathway has broken down. So even though you have fuel, you have the hormone to get the fuel into the cell, you're still not making energy from that fuel.
Okay. And so, what is the consequence as far as our weight when we have that insulin resistance?
So the glucose is going to be stored in fat. So it's going to lead to increased body mass as far as fat goes and weight gain. But the other piece of that I think is important to think about as far as weight goes is it's creating metabolic chaos. Because you're not using your fuel, as I mentioned earlier, cells are going to be starved. So you're probably actually going to feel hungry. A lot of times people with high blood sugar will actually feel low blood sugar because their cells aren't getting the nutrition that they need. And so it perpetuates this cycle because you feel hungry, you eat. A lot of times when there's insulin resistance, people aren't making good food choices. And so they'll choose something that will spike their blood glucose and then drop it later. And then they're hungry again. And it just creates this cycle where we're eating all the time, which is worsening insulin resistance. But the insulin resistance is what's driving it. And so it can be really hard to break that pattern and reverse it to get weight loss or shifting of body mass to more muscle when the insulin resistance is in the picture.
And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about some strategies for insulin resistance later. But I would like to ask here is how can we know what our insulin levels are doing? I mean, obviously we can get blood tests from our doctors. I've seen continuous glucose monitoring. If you've heard Huberman Lab, they'll talk about that, like to do some of those continuous glucose monitoring, but most of us aren't doing that. So how would we know if we are experiencing insulin resistance?
Yeah, so I think the first place that I start is looking at your eating windows when I'm trying to assess this with somebody. And I think eating and fasting windows are pretty controversial topics, especially when it comes to women and female hormones. But I think if you just kind of
Mhm.
zoom out and look at, as humans, I don't think our bodies were made to be eating constantly 24/7 nonstop. We were made for periods of feasting and famine because there's life happens, especially if you're living kind of more connected to the earth, there's oftentimes when food or resources can be scarce. So our bodies are made to be able to adapt to that. So a very simple thing I do is look at, can somebody go 12 hours overnight without eating? And I don't even consider that fasting. I just consider that a healthy window for your body to be able to switch in and out of. So if someone can't do that, I automatically know there's insulin resistance on board. They're getting way too many hunger cues. Another thing that I look at is symptoms related to food. So one would be potentially fatigue after eating, and that can be caused by you're not using your food to make energy. So you get fatigued. Also, a lot of times it can correlate with foods that are pro-inflammatory. It's a lot for the digestive tract to handle, so that can create fatigue. But sometimes I'm also looking at symptoms with not eating. So a lot of times people think I don't have a blood glucose problem because I get symptoms of hypoglycemia after, if I don't eat for 2 hours. Well, I put a glucose monitor on a lot of those people, and oftentimes the symptoms of hypoglycemia are actually related to high blood sugar because the person is not using their glucose to make energy. And even if they have a true hypoglycemia, unless they're calorically restricting in a significant way, oftentimes that's secondary to they ate something that spiked their blood glucose. And then sometimes when your body tries to get the glucose out of the blood in this situation of insulin resistance, when your cells aren't responsive, it'll kind of overcompensate and it'll pull the sugar out too quickly. And so then you end up with a blood glucose drop. And that's where we're seeing a hypoglycemia. So symptoms around food in general, whether it's hyperglycemia symptoms or hypoglycemia symptoms, both can be related to issues with insulin resistance. And then if somebody's snacking all the time or eating all the time throughout the day, that can also indicate insulin resistance because that indicates to me that they're getting too many hunger cues. And if I like to zoom out and think, if you can't switch between hunger and fed and sustain that for a good period of time, you're metabolically inflexible. So you don't switch very well between being fed and being hungry, and your body should be metabolically flexible.
So tell me more about that. Like, it should be easy to switch. You should be able to recognize your hunger cues, or what do you mean? Tell me about that, what that means exactly.
Yeah, so let's say somebody was working on their insulin resistance and they were actually becoming more insulin sensitive. I would actually expect for them to be able to go longer periods of time without eating. Or let's say, you're out. We've all had this happen where you're out, you get hungry, you don't have food, hangry sets in, less hangry type of symptoms, things like that, because your body knows how to, okay, I don't have fuel on board. I can break into my glucose stores. Most people are probably not starting to burn ketones in the amount of time they're experiencing hypoglycemia symptoms throughout a day, but your body is learning how to use backup fuel, available fuel, different types of fuel when you become more metabolically flexible. So a lot of the symptoms around food usually clear up. People can go longer without eating because their bodies are able to use the mechanisms we have for food scarcity.
Yeah, when I talk about this, about the space between your meals, that first hunger signal, when we kind of say like, okay, this is just the first one and we let that kind of go down, it will come and go in waves. And what I call that first drop, because you get hungry and then you get busy and you realize like, oh, it's been like 30, 45 minutes and now I have another hunger signal. And so I call that dining in, because we're using some of that onboard fuel that we stored. Like, your body knows what to do. If you give it too much fuel, it doesn't make you ill immediately. Your body's just like, no problem, we'll just store this for later. And so then that later has come. You're like, I can't bring on any outside fuel right now, so we're just going to dine in and eat a little bit, quote unquote, eat, but use the fuel that you have on board. And so, yeah, the more often that you can do that and be comfortable and know that hunger is not an emergency, because I like what you're saying, like, you're going to see less hangry meltdowns, because when we get that kind of hangry feeling, it's somewhat emotional because you're like, I have to eat right now. But when you kind of learn that hunger is not an emergency, and I like to sort of remove the word starving from our vocabularies, because if you ate breakfast, there's no possible way you're starving.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I love when my clients are like, well, I ate such and such for lunch because I was starving. And I was like, were you? Were you though?
Yeah. Although the tough thing about that is when there's insulin resistance on board, you can also become resistant to other hormones like leptin, and it basically turns on a starvation physiology in the body
Mm,
where you think that you're starving, but you're actually not. And one of the ways to reset that is actually going without food, because when you go without food, your insulin kind of pays more attention. And then when there is food in the body, you start listening to the insulin again. And the other thing I like to tell people is when we're shifting our metabolism, it's like exercise. It's not like you go and look in the mirror one day and say, I'm out of shape. And then the next day you're lifting like your goal amount at the gym and you're super fit. Sometimes you start small, and then as your fitness grows, you increase what you're able to do. And I've noticed that in my own journey with working on blood sugar and fasting. I used to not be able to fast at all. I mean, I would vomit. Sometimes if I skipped breakfast, I would vomit. I was that
mm,
sensitive. But as I slowly worked on things, then my time window, it increased and it increased and it increased. And I recently this week went about 10 hours over my usual limit. And when I reintroduced food, it didn't go well. So I realized, okay, I do have a limit still. This is where it's at, but it's increasing. And so
mhm.
you'll see shifts like that. It doesn't have to be all at once. You're, the super metabolic person you hear about on podcasts.
Mhm. Yeah. So, speaking of starting small,
Mhm,
I always start with snacking before I try to increase eating windows, which, like you said before, we're mostly just talking about like 12 hours. Like,
mhm,
let's stop eating at a regular time after dinner and wait until it's breakfast in the morning, which typically can be 12, sometimes even 14 hours. But
mhm.
what what we start with really is eliminating some of those snacks, because this eating, stopping, and then eating again does help with your insulin. So tell us what happens when we're snacking all the time and how that can affect us.
Yeah, so when we're snacking all the time, insulin is constantly being released. And what our insulin wants to do is it wants to be released with a meal and then to rest in between meals. Kind of gives your receptors a sense to reset. And then when a meal comes along, it's sensitive to insulin and can use up that sugar. When we're snacking all the time, insulin is being released all of the time. And that leads to that insulin insensitivity or insulin resistance. So cutting out snacking is a really good place to start.
And we're not talking about like a vast reduction in energy coming in, calories. We don't count calories in my program, but you can actually just combine those things that you love to eat for a snack. We combine those. I just call it consolidating your meals.
Mhm.
And so you're just putting whatever that mid-morning snack is that you like to eat, either add it to your breakfast or add it to your lunch. Is that how you do it?
Exactly. I do the exact same thing. And I like to stress two things when I'm cutting out snacking for people. One is we're not necessarily taking away joy foods. If you
Mm,
really love chips or you just have to have a sweet after dinner, I mean, there's some issues with that. We want to work on reducing cravings for those foods. But when we're first starting, a lot of times I'll say, why don't we just have you eat it as soon as you finish dinner, then you're going to have your sweet. As soon as you finish lunch, have your handful of popcorn or whatever. And we're not reducing calories. So there's some research where they looked at two groups. They ate the same amount of carbs and they ate the same amount of calories, but one group spread the carbs and calories throughout the day, and one group condensed them at meals. And the group who condensed them at meals had much better metabolic outcomes. And so it's really
mhm,
about more when you're eating than what you're eating. And the reason the group had the better metabolic outcomes was because they had better insulin sensitivity. So I will
mhm.
sometimes notice when I cut out snacking, I actually started eating much bigger meals than I used to. And I'll notice that in my patients too. I'll tell them it's okay if you're eating more at a meal. Maybe the reason you felt the urge to snack anyway was because you weren't eating enough nutrition. You should be able to
Mhm.
feel sustained for 3, 4 hours between meals.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question. What would be the time frame? So 3 or 4 hours would show us that we're not having a lot of insulin resistance. If you can comfortably go 3 or 4 hours, that's a good sign.
I like to say at least 3 hours because there are gut benefits to waiting 3 hours as well.
Oh, okay. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we have this migrating motor complex, or MMC, in our gut, and it's basically a series of contractions and secretions in our gut that cleans the gut out. So I mentioned earlier that ghrelin is secreted by the same cells that secrete hydrochloric acid. So when we're getting that hunger feeling, we're also getting digestive secretions. And if we just let that ride, when we don't feed, what happens then is that those digestive secretions go to clean up cell waste, they go to clean up digestive waste, and then the contractions help us expel it. It takes 3 hours for that to be stimulated, and it's also stimulated by ghrelin. So you have to get hungry,
Mm.
and you have to go a certain amount of time between meals. I do want to put the asterisk though. Some of my chronic illness patients, they don't necessarily feel hunger as in like hunger gnawing in your belly because of some of the inflammation and dysregulation going on in your body. There's different hunger cues. So, I don't want somebody to listen to this and go, 12 hours medically unsupervised, not eating anything because their body has an issue creating that hunger signal.
Sure. Yeah. And typically my listeners are women of generally good health. Most of my listeners are not chronic illness type situations. So typically we want to get to some hunger signals. I teach a lot about the hunger scale to wait for hunger. One of the things I think that about snacking is that we're not really waiting for hunger. We get a little bit hungry and then we get a little tiny bit full from the snack, and then we get a little bit hungry again and a little bit full, and we don't ever feel like true hunger and then true satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
So I always just say, like, let's just wait until we're actually hungry enough to eat a meal
Mm-hmm.
and then do that.
Right.
And so it sounds like that's also just excellent for your gut health, because when you are waiting that long, and if you are a typically healthy, somewhat healthy person, and you have healthy hunger signals that you just have been ignoring or that have been sort of distorted by your insulin resistance, if you don't have other chronic illness in the way of that, then we want to wait for hunger and let that happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is I think a lot of times women will get nervous, like, if I don't eat, well, finish that. What is going to happen? Are you going to pass out? I mean, if you're going to, there's definitely some insulin issues probably there if you're passing out if you don't eat, but maybe you need a more nutritious meal, or maybe, but most people are not going to pass out. Sometimes we're afraid that something bad is going to happen if we don't eat, but in most cases, as long as you have a healthy meal plan on board when you're eating and you're not starving and eating junk food, like in a restricted eating or a disordered eating type of process,
Mhm.
nothing bad is going to happen if you push past your hunger a little bit.
Yeah. Again, I think people are worried about the hangry, like,
Yeah.
I got to eat now. But yeah, really, hunger is a normal process. And I like to think of it just like when you're out and about and you're like, I don't really want to use that public bathroom. I'm just going to wait till I get home. That's a normal process. Your bladder is like, hey there, I'm full. We should probably empty me. And
Right.
you're
Right.
like, yeah, I totally will when I get home. And I
Mm-hmm.
think of it as the same kind of thing with our hunger signals. It's like, hey there, I could use some food. And you're like, yeah, I totally will when I get home or when I get food. It's not like a tragedy. It's like, okay, it's getting urgent to maybe use the bathroom or to feed. But I think that when we bring it up into an emotional thing with hangry getting mad that we aren't
Mm-hmm.
eating, like that's where we have some emotional hunger going on as well, which
Yes.
is
Yeah.
separate.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
Tell me more about other benefits of cutting out snacking, because this is actually something I think people don't realize. You get on Pinterest and it's so often it's like 30 healthy snacks,
Mm-hmm.
30 snacks to help you lose weight. And I'm like, how about just not?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I feel like I see that all the time on Facebook. Anyone have any suggestions for low calorie snacks? I'm like, just not, just eat
Yeah.
at mealtime.
Yeah.
It makes me crazy. So I think it's out there so much, and people don't realize how many benefits there are of consolidating your meals.
Yes. So I think the main thing that I would say is eating more nutritious meals. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're feeling the need to snack all the time, Maybe you're not eating enough calories at mealtime. Maybe you're not eating nutritious enough foods. When you're really sitting down to a meal, a lot of times it gets you thinking about, what am I going to consume? What is going to sustain me? And you kind of get an idea for what holds you throughout the day and what doesn't. I think it also creates more mindfulness around eating, which is important for digestion. So the first stage of digestion actually happens when we start thinking about and interacting with food. So a lot of times snacking is kind of done mindlessly while we're working, while we're doing other things. Whereas if we're sitting down to a meal, we're really focusing on that, and that actually supports our digestion. So better digestion. And then there's all of the benefits that go along with reducing insulin resistance. Insulin resistance doubles risk of cancer. I think that is just such a staggering statistic. And most people,
Wow.
yeah, I would say like 95% of the people that I check for insulin resistance have some form of it going on, even ones who eat pretty healthy. It also, reducing insulin resistance reduces your risk of cardiovascular disease, of diabetes, of hormone imbalances, of weight issues. And then I also see that a lot of times people are sleeping better when they're not snacking, because our elevated blood glucose, a lot of the hormones that have to go along with eating, are not friendly for quality sleep. And so that can be a benefit as well.
That's a huge list.
Yeah.
I mean, just your chance of cancer, like that's crazy
Yeah.
because of insulin resistance. I did not know about that connection. So
Yeah.
that's pretty
That really
important.
got my attention when I first heard that out. I had to go back and listen multiple times to make sure that I heard correctly. So,
One of the challenges I see with my clients with snacking is that more often than not, the snacking is what I call emotional hunger. I've alluded to that a little bit this episode, but physical hunger is coming from the body. It's a signal you're feeling physically, and then your brain becomes aware. Whereas emotional hunger is your brain being like, you know what would be good right now? A snack. You know what would help me with get this email done is having some chocolate at the same time. And I notice what my clients struggle with. Like I had someone yesterday just say, every time I finish with a client, they're a tax accountant. Every time I finish with a client, I go have a snack. And then I have
mm,
another client meeting and then I have a snack.
yeah.
And in the snacking is actually not being driven by hunger so much as being driven by discomfort
Mm-hmm.
and soothing emotions. And so what's happening is we get this emotional hunger and then we're messing up our insulin,
Mm-hmm.
causing us to then want to get the snack even more often. So I feel like it's like this vicious circle of emotional hunger versus the physical hunger.
Yeah, it's good to know the difference between the two. I do think, food is nourishing, and anytime something's nourishing, it has a comfort element to it. And so I don't think gravitating to more comforting foods under stress is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I'll confess, when I'm stressed, I eat more dark chocolate. It's just, I do, but I think when we are relying on it to be our stress relief, if somebody's kind of eating, I'm stressed, I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna cook this recipe that my mom always cooked growing up. Like, that's a very appropriate way to
To
get some
use food.
comfort benefits of food. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. But when we're using it, we don't have any other stress relief and food is it. That, I think, is when we really see a lot of problems.
Yeah, definitely. When food becomes our main source of comfort and stress
Mhm.
relief, then that can be an issue. And then just the idea of if we decide, okay, I think what they're saying is a good idea for me, that I need to cut out snacking, then we have to address some of the emotional reasons of why we are snacking.
Absolutely. And discomfort will come up. And I think, to me, that was one of the hidden blessings of chronic illness. I'm not calling, chronic illness good and intrinsically, but there are things I learned from it. And for me, there are certain foods that it is just not an option for me. A lot of people think, well, 80-20 rule. 80-20 rule
Mm.
doesn't work for me for most things. For the things I need to avoid, it's 100-100,
Yeah.
And and when you go through the process of coming off of food, I mean, you have to remember, food causes your brain to release dopamine, causes your brain to release serotonin, all these like reward and happy chemicals. Food can trigger the release of those. And so when you're coming off of it, you can have a drug like withdrawal. And I remember certain things like feeling angry, or feeling left out that I couldn't eat what everybody else was eating. And then I kind of had to tune in and think to myself, well, do I want to look at myself as a victim, like, poor me, I can't eat ice cream and everyone else is? Or do I really want to give ice cream that much power, that that's what gives me a sense of belonging with other people, that that's what connects me with other people, that brings joy in a situation? And so I was able to recognize there definitely were ways that I was looking to food to, create bonding and connection and stress relief, that I didn't have to live like that anymore. I could live in a more empowered way. So you will have discomfort come up, but I think it's a really good opportunity to take a deeper look at what's going on inside of you.
Yeah, perfect. I love that. Thank you so much. Do you have anything else to add? This has been a great conversation. I think people are really going to benefit from learning about all of this.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it. I would say, kind of go with what feels right for you from what we've talked about in this podcast. Don't be afraid to start small. And I do have a metabolic restart protocol. It's not available yet. I'm working on some resources to help make that really readily available to people in ways that will help them, empower them to take control of their own health. So keep an eye out for that.
Okay, perfect. Well, we'll definitely link to your Instagram and your website so people can connect with you and watch for that coming out in the next few months. That'll be really helpful.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, thank you. Hey, thanks for listening today. If you're ready to get some personalized coaching from me, I'd encourage you to schedule a free strategy session. Visit www.wellwithlisa.as.me, or it's easier just to find that link in the show notes. We'll talk about where you currently are with your weight loss goals, and I'll give you some actionable tools you can start implementing right away. Before you go, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you can receive new episodes right when they're released. And if you're learning something new and enjoying the podcast, I'd love for you to leave me a 5-star rating and a review. Thanks again for joining me, Lisa Salisbury, in this episode of Eat Well, Think Well, Live Well.